Okay, this is part 3 of the Fluoride, good for business, but is it good for us essay. There was truly much more going on than just an ostensible campaign to save the children's teeth. The government's view on the matter at hand was chilling. Quote, disclosure would be injurious to the military security of the United States, wrote Manhattan Project Major C.A. Taney Jr., quoted in Bryson 76. The data from the fluoridation experiment would be, quote, helpful to the nuclear weapons industry, explained the Manhattan Project's first medical director, Heimer L. Friedel, quoted in Bryson 84. Also, with fluoride legally present in the water, suing the government or its contractors for air pollution would now be practically impossible. After examining the correspondence between Newberg's fluoridation planners and the Manhattan Project leaders, scientist and historian Newell Stannard came to a stunning conclusion. Quote, I don't think the military was really interested in water fluoridation. I think they were looking for information on toxicity on fluoride and fluorides, quoted in Bryson 87. Another curious arrangement comes into play. Andrew W. Mellon, the founder of Alcoa, Aluminum Company of America, and one of its biggest stockholders, was also the U.S. Treasury Secretary from 1921 to 1932. Because U.S. Public Health Service was at that time a subdivision of the Treasury Department, further suspicions inevitably arise in regard to the loyalty of his intentions. The same troublesome trend continued until 1947, when an ex-Wall Street lawyer for Alcoa, Edward Ewing, was elected as the head of the Federal Security Agency with jurisdiction over the Public Health Service, PHS. It was Ewing, on behalf of PHS, who reversed the long-standing opposition to fluoridation in 1950, Bryson 147. Though much of the inner workings of this supplanting force was kept in the dark for many decades under the guise of national security, recently declassified documents, as well as interviews with individuals involved, illustrate the government's frightening compromise. The full scope of this arrangement can only be understood when the secrecy begins to relinquish its hold on truth. A monumental event that helped to bring a tide of disclosure occurred when an investigative journalist named Eileen Wellsom won a Pulitzer Prize in 1994, quote, for revealing how atomic bomb program doctors had injected plutonium into hospital patients, end quote, in order to study its lethal effects, Bryson 27. Evidence exposed shocking experiments performed on prisoners, pregnant women, and retarded children. Some of those involved, such as Dr. Harold Carpenter Hodge, who was a toxicologist investigating fluoride for the U.S. Army's Manhattan Project, were instrumental in convincing the U.S. Congress that water fluoridation was harmless. During a hearing for House Resolution 2341, a bill which would have made fluoridation of water illegal, Dr. Hodge assured all who were present that, quote, even if all the fluoride ingested in the drinking water, 1 part per million, in a lifetime, were stored in the skeleton, no injury would occur. United States 472. At the time, Dr. Hodge was a member of the Mellon Institute's Industrial Hygiene Association, a lobbying group for industrial giants such as Alcoa, U.S. Steel, and DuPont. To say that he was upholding the interests of the general public would be downright shameful. Toxicologist Paul Marrow knew Harold Hodge very well. They worked together for 20 years. Quote, Hodge pioneered fluoridation very adamantly, Marrow pointed out. Quote, that was one of the most difficult things he did. There was an extraordinary resistance to the use of rat poison in public water supplies, quoted in Bryson 91. Besides the onslaught of lawsuits from employees and distraught farmers, the political entities that constituted the Iron Triangle were facing another difficulty. Quote, if the United States were compelled to rely on natural fluorspar alone, serious obstacles to growth and security would emerge, stated Donner M. Lyon from the Paley Commission, quoted in Bryson 149. It seemed whenever profit was to be made, solutions quickly appeared on the scene. Quote, the government wanted the Florida fluoride in case of wartime emergency, but the state's phosphate producers needed a carrot before capturing their toxic waste. Bryson 150. At that time, fluoride was nothing more than an air pollutant. It billowed freely into the stacks of phosphate factories which produced commercial fertilizer. A mutually auspicious arrangement was worked out, and it would not only benefit the phosphate industry and the government's fluoride predicament, but also the Atomic Energy Commission as well, since the process of phosphate mining also yielded non-negligible quantities of uranium. Such success resonated within U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, well into the 80s, when the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Water, Rebecca Hamner, wrote, quote, by recovering byproduct fluosilicic acid from the fertilizer manufacturing, water and air pollution are minimized, and water utilities have a low-cost source of fluoride available to them, quoted in Bryson 151. In essence, instead of paying expensive fees to neutralize corrosive waste, the taxpayers now paid the phosphate industry good money for their toxic sludge to be injected straight into the tap. There was perhaps one more reason why fluoridation became such an unyielding force in spite of the public's outcry. To say that Edward Ewing, FSA, PHS, Alcoa, hired a good public relations representative to manage his fluoridation campaign would be an understatement. Edward Bernays, who was the nephew of now legendary Austrian neurologist Sigmund Freud, invented the field of public relations. His seminal works such as Propaganda, Crystallizing Mass Opinion, and The Engineering of Consent set the marching orders for the ubiquitous PR industry. Quote, you can get practically any idea accepted, Bernays would say, and if doctors are in favor, the public is willing to accept it, because a doctor is an authority to most people, regardless of how much he knows or doesn't know, quoted in Bryson 159. The father of spin had keen insight into the methodology of appealing to people's subconscious desires in order to achieve specific goals. Bernays operated on a principle that, quote, to influence the public, the engineer of consent works with and through a group of leaders and opinion molders on every level. Century of Self. When Edward Bernays started revamping the image of fluoride, he had a solid plan. Quote, we would put out the definition first to the editors of important newspapers, and then we would send a letter to publishers of dictionaries and encyclopedias. After 6 or 8 months, we would find the word fluoridation was published and defined in dictionaries and encyclopedias, quoted in Bryson 161. During a campaign to introduce fluoridation to New York, a deceptively titled Committee to Protect Our Children's Teeth was adorned with, quote, a long list of celebrities, liberals, and notables, including Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt, baseball great Jackie Robinson, as well as others. The other focus of the fluoridation agenda called to discredit and castigate any individuals or organizations that oppose fluoridation, parading them as, quote, food faddists, cultists, chiropractors, and misguided and misinformed persons who are ignorant of the scientific facts involved. Bryson 162. I'll just do the conclusion in the last part.